We cannot remain silent any longer. Our future is at stake. We must act now. Rise with me.
Before sunrise touched the hills outside Nairobi in 1898, Makena Njeri was already on the road, carrying secrets powerful enough to shift resistance movements. She wasn't a soldier or leader, just a courier, yet the messages she smuggled across colonial lines made her one of the most dangerous invisible figures in British territory. The first time British officers realized their patrol routes were compromised, they blamed coincidence. A missed interception here, an empty hideout there, supply convoys arriving at rebel camps just hours before raids were launched. It felt like someone invisible was moving through their carefully drawn lines, threading past checkpoints and rifles and suspicion itself. They did not yet know the name Makena Njeri. They did not know that the messages slipping through their fingers were carried not by soldiers or spies trained in war, but by a young woman who walked the red earth paths of Nairobi with the stillness of someone who had learned early that survival meant being underestimated. In 1898, Nairobi was not yet the crowded capital it would become. It was a growing colonial outpost carved into the highland grasslands, a railway depot swollen with temporary structures, tin roofs, wooden beams, and the smell of fresh sawdust mingling with smoke from charcoal fires. British engineers and administrators saw it as a node of empire, a place to control trade, labor, and movement along the Uganda Railway. But beneath the surface of colonial order lived another reality. Communities disrupted by land seizure, labor demands, and political humiliation. Tension did not announce itself loudly. It simmered quietly in markets and homesteads, in glances exchanged when soldiers passed, in whispered plans spoken only after darkness settled. Makena Njeri had grown up within this shifting landscape. Born into a Kikuyu family living on the outskirts of the expanding settlement, she understood land not as territory, but as ancestry, inheritance, and identity. Her earliest memories were shaped by the rhythms of cultivation, storytelling by firelight, and the lessons her mother insisted she learn about awareness. How to read the posture of strangers, how to judge distance by sound, how to notice when silence itself carried meaning. None of this was taught as preparation for rebellion. It was survival knowledge, cultural inheritance, passed down with the expectation that the world beyond their village would demand attentiveness. By her late teens, Makena had become known for her composure. She spoke little, listened carefully, and moved with an unhurried confidence that drew trust without demanding attention. When colonial expansion intensified and small resistance networks formed among displaced groups, it was not inevitable that she would become involved. There was no dramatic recruitment or oath under moonlight. It began more simply. A relative asked her to carry a verbal message to another settlement. Nothing written, nothing incriminating, just words memorized and delivered. She agreed, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the subtle sense that neutrality was becoming impossible. What she discovered on that first journey changed her. Moving between communities exposed her to stories of forced labor conscriptions, confiscated grazing lands, and arrests carried out under authority that felt distant and arbitrary. Anger alone did not define her response. It was clarity. She recognized that resistance required not only fighters, but connectors, individuals capable of crossing boundaries without drawing notice. Messages, plans, warnings. These were the lifeblood of coordination. And coordination was fragile. It could collapse entirely if intercepted. She volunteered again and again until her role was understood without being formally named. The methods she developed were shaped by necessity and instinct. Written notes were dangerous, so information was often encoded in song fragments or woven into mundane conversation patterns she could recall precisely. Sometimes small objects, beads arranged in particular sequences, knotted cords tucked into baskets, carried meaning invisible to outsiders. She traveled as traders traveled, carrying produce or cloth, presenting herself as ordinary, because ordinary people rarely triggered alarm. British patrols tended to watch for armed men or gatherings of suspicious size. A solitary woman walking between settlements did not fit their expectation of threat. Makena understood this perception and used it not with arrogance but careful discipline. Crossing British lines required patience rather than speed. Checkpoints were unpredictable, their enforcement depending on mood, weather, and rumor. Makena learned to observe from distance, reading posture and tone among guards before approaching. She carried herself neither submissively nor defiantly, offering brief answers, maintaining eye contact just long enough to appear cooperative, never inviting prolonged scrutiny. Each successful crossing strengthened her confidence, but also sharpened her awareness of risk. Capture would not mean simple detention. Interrogation and punishment were realities she considered each time she stepped onto the path. The network she served grew more reliant on her reliability. She carried warnings about troop movement, instructions for supply redistribution, and confirmations of safe routes. Some journeys lasted hours. Others stretched across days, requiring rest in unfamiliar settlements where trust could not be assumed. The psychological weight of responsibility deepened. Failure would not affect her alone. Entire groups could be exposed, yet she rarely spoke of fear. Instead, she treated each mission as a sequence of solvable problems. Distance to manage, terrain to interpret, human behavior to anticipate. One evening near the close of the rainy season, she accepted an assignment more consequential than any before. Intelligence suggested that a British sweep was planned against several coordinated communities suspected of harboring resistance organizers. If the warning did not arrive in time, arrests and dismantling of local leadership were almost certain. Makena set out before dawn, the air cool and damp, soil clinging to her sandals as she moved across fields washed clean by overnight rain. Clouds hung low, muting color and sound, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the quiet beauty of morning before returning focus to the urgency ahead. Midway through her route, she encountered increased patrol presence. The colonial authorities, sensing unrest, had tightened observation. Soldiers stood along paths she had previously crossed freely. Adapting without hesitation, she diverted toward less direct routes, navigating through tall grass and uneven terrain that slowed her progress but reduced visibility. The tension was physical now. Heart rhythm steady yet elevated, senses sharpened to the scrape of branches and distant voices. She was not chased, but the possibility hovered close enough to taste. As afternoon stretched toward dusk, she reached the final checkpoint before her destination. This crossing demanded composure beyond routine. Guards questioned travelers longer than usual, searching bags and scrutinizing answers. When her turn came, Makena felt the weight of memorized information pressing behind her calm expression. She allowed fatigue to show slightly. Believable after a long walk, while answering simply about visiting relatives and trading goods. Seconds elongated. A guard studied her, perhaps sensing nothing, perhaps suspecting everything. Finally, he stepped aside, uninterested or unconvinced that she mattered. She continued forward without looking back, only allowing tension to release once distance shielded her from their view. She arrived after nightfall. Firelight illuminated faces that shifted from anxiety to relief as she delivered her message. The response was immediate. Plans altered, movements initiated, dispersals organized. Watching the transformation of information into action impressed upon her again the magnitude of seemingly small acts. She had not fought or commanded, yet the outcome hinged partly on her arrival. Satisfaction mingled with exhaustion, and she rested briefly before beginning the return journey, knowing the cycle would continue. Makena Njeri's work did not end with a single mission, nor did it conclude with recognition or ceremony. The colonial environment persisted, resistance evolved, and countless stories like hers remained undocumented beyond oral memory. She continued carrying messages, refining techniques, and navigating the delicate balance between invisibility and impact. Her legacy was not defined by dramatic confrontation, but by sustained courage expressed through repetition. Each step across contested ground reinforcing a network built on trust and resilience. In the years that followed, Nairobi transformed further under colonial administration, growing into the structured center envisioned by its planners. Yet, beneath the visible architecture of empire, lingered the quieter history of individuals who shaped outcomes without appearing in official records. Makena's journeys existed within that hidden layer, where determination traveled on footpaths and loyalty was measured not in declarations, but in distance covered under risk. To consider her story now is to imagine those silent crossings. The dust underfoot, the watchful eyes at barriers, the memorized words carried carefully across landscapes both physical and political. It is to recognize that resistance is often sustained not solely by confrontation, but by connection. And somewhere along the early roads of Nairobi, long before the city's skyline emerged, a young courier walked with messages held in memory, altering the course of events one careful step at a time, leaving behind no monument but the echo of paths that history itself would later struggle to trace. Makena did not sleep long after delivering the warning, because rest had become something she experienced in fragments rather than comfort, and even as the settlement around her quieted, she remained aware of the invisible consequences already unfolding across the region. Patrol routes shifting, suspicions growing sharper, British officers comparing reports that never aligned with their expectations, and by the time she resumed walking before sunrise, the air carried the tension of a landscape beginning to react to something it could not yet identify. The grass is damp against her ankles, the horizon pale and uncertain, and though her body carried fatigue, her mind had already turned toward the next calculation, because she understood instinctively that success invited scrutiny, that each avoided interception would encourage the authorities to look harder, listen closer, question longer, and somewhere within Nairobi's expanding colonial administration, that process had already begun. Officers gathering around wooden tables cluttered with maps, tracing missed operations with blunt fingers and tightening their interpretation of coincidence into suspicion. Voices lowered but firm, concluding that coordination among local populations was increasing beyond rumor, and that meant someone was connecting them. Someone unseen but consistent, and from that realization, orders spread outward. More patrols assigned, inspections intensified, identities questioned with sharper impatience, and Makena encountered the results within days, when routes that once felt navigable now held unfamiliar faces, carrying rifles with greater alertness, forcing her to adjust again, not through panic, but observation, studying their rhythm from distances that kept her unnoticed, altering her path through cultivation fields and tree lines, sometimes doubling back and losing hours simply to ensure that her presence remained forgettable, because she had come to understand that invisibility required effort equal to confrontation. And yet the psychological strain of that awareness grew heavier as the missions continued, not because she doubted herself, but because the margin between success and exposure narrowed with every journey, and still she accepted another message when it came, this one encoded through layered memory rather than objects, a sequence of names and locations whose order mattered more than wording, information intended to coordinate movements across multiple settlements in anticipation of further disruption. And as she committed it to memory, she felt something different from previous assignments, not fear exactly, but the sense of standing closer to consequence, as though the network itself were expanding in complexity, and she along with it, her steps now threading between larger forces gathering momentum beyond any individual's control, and the journey that followed unfolded beneath skies thick with heat, cicadas droning in relentless rhythm while she moved between clusters of huts and stretches of open ground, where distance exposed travelers to distant watchers, and twice she noticed riders far behind on the path, silhouettes indistinct but persistent enough that she left the main route entirely, cutting through brush that scratched her skin and slowed her breathing, crouching once behind a fallen trunk as hoofbeats passed close enough for her to feel vibration through soil, remaining still until silence returned and only then continuing. Her composure intact, yet sharpened by the understanding that she was no longer moving through oversight, defined by routine but by intent. And when she eventually reached the midpoint settlement, the reception lacked the relief she had grown used to, replaced by urgency bordering on quiet alarm, elders speaking rapidly, plans revising in response to rumors of arrests carried out farther west, and Makena delivered her memorized sequence while absorbing the weight of their reaction, recognizing that the environment she navigated was shifting towards something harsher and less predictable. And she stayed only long enough to eat before beginning the return, unwilling to anchor herself where her presence might invite attention. And it was during that return that confrontation approached closer than ever before. Not dramatic or explosive, but slow and suffocating as she neared a narrow crossing where two soldiers waited beside a temporary barrier of timber and rope, their posture different from routine guards, their questioning methodical rather than casual, and when they searched her basket, she kept her breathing steady despite knowing that nothing incriminating lay within. Yet aware that suspicion required no evidence to become action, their eyes lingering, their questions repeating with subtle variation meant to catch inconsistency, and for a moment she sensed the fragile edge of exposure hovering just beyond control. But she answered evenly, drawing upon fatigue, familiarity, and the practiced neutrality she had cultivated. And eventually, they allowed her through not with dismissal but reluctance, their gaze following longer than comfort permitted, and she walked on, resisting the urge to accelerate, understanding that composure must extend beyond inspection, and only once distance dissolved their presence did she allow the tremor of delayed reaction to pass through her chest. The acknowledgement that survival sometimes hinged on the narrowest interpretation of normalcy. And from that day forward, she sensed that the authorities were searching for patterns. And somewhere in that tightening search, her existence had begun to cast a faint outline. They could not yet see clearly, and weeks later, confirmation arrived indirectly when word spread through the network that several couriers in neighboring regions had been detained or questioned extensively, their routes compromised, their reliability disrupted. And though Makena remained unexposed, she felt the emotional shift such knowledge carried, a recognition that chance alone could not protect indefinitely, that skill must deepen, caution intensify, and a commitment remain unwavering even as stakes rose beyond abstraction. And it was during this period that she confronted an internal transformation not often recorded in stories of resistance, the gradual realization that identity itself had shifted, that she was no longer simply a participant assisting others, but a central thread in continuity, and with that came solitude, the inability to share the full weight of her responsibilities even among those she trusted, because secrecy preserved not just information, but people. And nights grew longer as thought replaced rest, her mind replaying routes and contingencies, measuring risk against necessity, and yet she continued because turning away now would fracture connections already depending upon her, and thus another mission carried her farther than previous journeys, across terrain stretching towards settlements where language and custom shifted subtly, reminding her of the diversity woven through the region she helped connect, and the path unfolded under heavy skies threatening rain, wind-bending grasses and carrying distant thunder, and she moved steadily despite weather because delay carried consequences beyond discomfort, arriving soaked but resolute, delivering intelligence that altered preparations once again. And as she watched groups disperse strategically, she felt a brief moment of quiet affirmation. Not pride, but awareness that effort translated into survival, and on her return beneath clearing skies, the landscape seemed momentarily still, sunset spilling amber across rolling ground, and she allowed herself reflection, recognizing that history might never name individuals like her, yet would carry echoes shaped by their persistence, and somewhere beyond sight, British officers continued mapping disruptions they could not fully explain, tightening surveillance incrementally closer to the truth. And Makena walked onward through lengthening shadows, sensing that the space between concealment and discovery was narrowing, that future journeys would demand even greater resilience. And though uncertainty stretched ahead, she did not slow, because the road itself had become inseparable from who she was, and whatever consequences waited beyond the horizon would meet her in motion rather than retreat. Understood. I'll continue seamlessly from the last segment, deepen her psychology and emotional interior. Maintain cinematic narration, preserve realism, keep strong pacing, and present it as one continuous block with no paragraph breaks. By the time Makena understood that fear had become a permanent companion rather than an occasional visitor, she no longer tried to push it away, because fear in her world was not weakness but information, a tightening in the chest that sharpened her hearing, a prickle along the skin that urged her to look twice at a movement in tall grass. And as she walked the worn red paths that threaded the Nairobi highlands, she carried that awareness with disciplined calm, feeling the weight of everything she could not speak aloud, the memory of faces lost to arrests, the quiet knowledge that every successful crossing drew her deeper into a life from which ordinary belonging had begun to fade. And sometimes she wondered if anyone outside the network could still see her as she had once been, a daughter of cultivation and storytelling, a young woman whose identity had been rooted in seasons and soil rather than in silence and encoded memory. Yet those earlier versions of herself never fully vanished. They lived beneath the hardened instincts, shaping her endurance, reminding her that what she defended was not abstract defiance, but continuity of people who defined themselves through land, lineage, and shared voice. And when she closed her eyes at night, she sometimes heard her mother's teachings as clearly as if spoken beside her. Lessons about patience, observation, respect for the unseen balance of community, and those memories steadied her when exhaustion blurred judgment, anchoring her within something older than colonial lines and military authority. Something impossible to confiscate, and still the strain left marks she could not ignore. Her sleep punctuated by dreams where checkpoints stretched endlessly, or questions became accusations she could not answer. Waking with pulse racing and breath shallow before grounding herself in familiar sounds of dawn, the crackle of firewood, distant livestock, the whisper of wind through thatch. And each morning she rose knowing recovery would never be complete, only sufficient to continue because survival had shifted from instinct to vocation. And she had learned to move through trauma not by denying it, but by compartmentalizing sensation, separating fear from action, grief from decision, storing each emotion until a safer moment that rarely arrived. And on one particular journey, as she crossed a stretch of scrubland where heat shimmered above the earth, she found her thoughts drifting toward the first message she had carried years before, recalling the naive clarity with which she believed effort alone determined outcome, and the contrast with her present understanding was stark. She knew now that randomness shaped fate as powerfully as skill, that capture or escape might hinge on a single overlooked detail, a stranger's suspicion, a misjudged pause, and accepting that uncertainty had not paralyzed her, but refined her focus, pushing her toward meticulous awareness that bordered on intuition, sensing mood in voices before words formed, detecting tension in the spacing of patrols, reading silence itself as signal. And it was during these solitary walks that transformation revealed itself most clearly, not as dramatic revelation, but gradual reshaping, the realization that identity was no longer singular. She was courier and witness, participant and observer, individual and conduit, and sometimes that multiplicity left her feeling suspended between worlds, belonging everywhere and nowhere, welcomed yet never entirely known, and despite isolation, she found motivation within connection to those who depended on her, the knowledge that elders waited for information that could preserve their autonomy, that families relocated because warnings reached them in time, that resistance endured through invisible cooperation, and this sense of responsibility outweighed doubt, forging determination grounded not in heroism, but obligation, And as months passed, the colonial presence intensified. Rail lines expanding, administrative control tightening, and with it, the psychological landscape altered. Suspicion seeping into ordinary encounters, conversations measured more carefully. Strangers evaluated with cautious reserve, and Makena navigated this shifting environment with heightened vigilance, storing observations the way others stored provisions, building internal maps that extended beyond geography into behavior and probability, and yet beneath her composure lived fatigue she rarely acknowledged. Muscles carrying accumulated strain, shoulders tightening at unexpected noise, the body remembering danger even when mind insisted on calm, and once while resting beside a shallow stream, she caught sight of her reflection, trembling in water disturbed by breeze. And she studied the face looking back, older in expression than years accounted for. Eyes sharpened by experience, yet still carrying the quiet warmth shaped by upbringing. And in that moment, she felt both loss and resilience, recognizing the cost of transformation without regretting its necessity. And when she resumed walking, her steps carried renewed clarity, accepting that she had become shaped by circumstance, yet remained guided by inherited values. And soon afterward, another mission required passage through a region where British activity had grown erratic, patrols moving unpredictably, and as she approached the outskirts of a checkpoint, she felt familiar tightening along her spine, her mind rehearsing possibilities, preparing responses before confrontation occurred, and the encounter unfolded with heightened scrutiny. Guards pressing for details about destinations and companions, their tone sharper than routine, and while answering she monitored her own breathing, grounding herself through tactile awareness of basket handle against palm, using sensation to anchor composure, and eventually she moved beyond them. But the encounter lingered in her thoughts long after, a reminder that danger was not solely physical, but psychological erosion, the constant testing of identity under authority that sought to redefine worth and belonging. And later, as she delivered her message to waiting listeners, she found herself speaking more quietly than usual, aware that each word she transmitted carried fragments of her own endurance, and their gratitude stirred something complex within her. A mixture of humility and weight, because she knew their reliance increased expectation she must meet regardless of personal cost. And as she departed under gathering dusk, she reflected on the path ahead, not imagining resolution or recognition, only continuation. The cycle of movement and memory, and somewhere between footsteps and thought, she realized her motivation had shifted from reaction to purpose. She no longer acted merely because injustice demanded response, but because participation itself affirmed identity, preserving connection to culture and community that colonization sought to fracture. And walking beneath stars emerging one by one above the vast Kenyan sky, she felt both small and resolute, a single presence within currents far larger than herself, yet undeniably part of shaping them. And though uncertainty shadowed every horizon, she embraced forward motion, carrying within her the layered consciousness of daughter, courier, survivor, and witness. Understanding that history would remember outcomes more readily than individuals, yet believing that meaning existed regardless of recognition. And with that awareness, she continued along dim paths, where night insects hummed and distant fires glowed faintly, her mind alert yet steady, her spirit marked by hardship yet guided by belonging, and step by step she advanced into darkness, not as someone lost within it, but as someone who had learned to navigate by its subtler light. The nights in Nairobi grew heavier with each passing season, a darkness that settled over the highlands like a living presence, and Makena Njeri learned to walk within it as if it were a familiar room, the crunch of her sandals against the red earth, a metronome for focus. Each sound around her a snapping twig, the distant cry of a bush owl, the restless movement of livestock in pens. Registered immediately, layering context and warning into a map she could read with eyes closed. And yet the physical landscape was only part of her navigation, because every patrol, every random traveler, every settler with suspicious curiosity represented a human terrain equally fraught, and she moved among them carrying the constant hum of calculation and memory, replaying recent encounters to anticipate reactions, replaying words to ensure clarity of communication. Mentally rehearsing possibilities as a chess master anticipates moves 3 turns ahead, and this mental vigilance carried weight, because to falter was not just to risk herself, but to imperil the fragile webs of safety she had helped construct, and that burden sometimes pressed down like the humid air before the rain, tangible and inescapable, making each journey a negotiation between body, mind, and the invisible presence of consequence. Makena had learned to inhabit multiple roles at once: courier, observer, daughter, memory keeper, silent witness. And each role demanded a calibration of instinct and will, a splitting of self that required attention to nuance and detail, because human behavior was as unpredictable as terrain. Yet she had discovered that observing patterns: a guard's habitual whistle, the rhythmic pacing of a sentry, the cadence of horse hooves across compacted soil, allowed prediction without reliance on chance. And in these moments her cultural inheritance became a secret weapon. Lessons from ancestors who read the land for water and danger, who interpreted wind and shadow as signals, who understood that survival was never passive but participatory, that awareness was devotion, and these teachings she internalized, transforming instinct into discipline, shaping every decision she made. Yet transformation came at a cost. Trauma shadowed her steps in subtle ways she rarely named aloud: a flinch at sudden noise, the tightening of stomach muscles when someone's gaze lingered too long, the weight of imagined consequences pressing on her chest when she considered what might happen to those relying on her accuracy. She understood the human mind's capacity to fracture under unrelenting stress, and she guarded against that quietly, creating rituals of preparation. Touching the handle of her basket just so, whispering a fragment of song to anchor memory, tracing a finger along the seams of cloth to measure her heartbeat. Small gestures that grounded her when the world threatened to overwhelm. And there were times when exhaustion became more than physical, when the long nights of concealment and vigilance left her vulnerable to doubt, when she imagined capture, interrogation, the sound of her own name uttered by someone who would use it as a weapon, and in those moments she summoned the voices of her mother and grandmother, the ancestral cadence of survival, repeating silent lessons until the body and mind aligned once more with purpose. Her understanding of fear evolved into something more complex than mere avoidance. It became a tool, a signal, a language through which she interpreted the environment. Fear was not something to erase, it was to read. A tightening in the throat might indicate an approaching patrol. The sudden silence of birds might signal a distant presence. She learned to translate physiological reactions into strategic decisions, a symbiosis of body and intellect. And with this mastery came an emotional sophistication that exceeded her years. She could project confidence where she felt vulnerability, calm where tension simmered beneath skin, and this skill became as vital as memorizing encoded messages or observing safe paths. Because her success depended not only on what she carried, but how she embodied herself within the world of those who would see her as unthreatening. The monotony of repetition was punctuated by moments of acute tension that shaped her psyche in ways both visible and invisible. Once, while crossing a ridge near a newly established railway line, she encountered a detachment of British engineers inspecting progress. Their presence was ordinary, part of a mental map of risk, yet one of the men lingered, gaze sharp, suspicion flickering across his expression like lightning. Every step she had rehearsed, every posture she had studied in solitude became vital now, her heart thundering, sweat prickling the back of her neck, breath steady despite panic's insistence. She smiled faintly, gestured to imaginary terrain as though lost in thought, and passed. Only later, crouched beneath the canopy of an acacia, did her body release tension in shivers, her fingers trembling against the rough bark. And she realized again that her life had become a negotiation between calculation and instinct, a constant balance between visibility and invisibility. Makena's relationship with the messages she carried was deeply intimate. Each phrase she memorized, each encoded signal she delivered, was a living thread, connecting communities across invisible lines of control, and she understood that words were more than communication. They were instruments of survival, carriers of intention, and sometimes the only lifeline between those who would be hunted and those who had knowledge of safe refuge. The act of memorization was not passive. She repeated phrases under breath while walking, spoke them into shadows, imagined entire sequences unfolding as though the voices of distant allies responded, creating a mental theater in which errors were rehearsed and corrected before reality ever arrived. Each message delivered was an affirmation that knowledge could resist authority, that invisible labor could yield tangible protection, and that courage need not announce itself to be effective. Cultural identity undergirded her every action. Makena's awareness of Kikuyu cosmology and social structure informed her decisions and her ethics, embedding a moral compass that guided her even in morally ambiguous circumstances. She respected boundaries, understood the importance of lineage and land, and navigated her actions within the framework of communal responsibility. Her work as courier was not a solitary pursuit of personal vendetta, but a culturally contextualized mission, honoring the continuity of people, practices, and traditions threatened by colonial imposition. Her movement across contested terrain was a ritualized performance, a blend of inherited knowledge and adaptive strategy, ensuring that the fabric of her community could endure even if individual lives were imperiled. Trauma responses intertwined with these cultural frameworks, creating complex internal rhythms. She sometimes relived moments of sudden violence or witnessed cruelty within her network, yet she learned to process such experiences through ritual, story, and reflection, converting trauma into focus rather than paralysis. Each encounter with potential harm reinforced neural pathways, linking observation with decision, emotion with action, memory with improvisation, and over time, this layering created an internal landscape where danger was anticipated before it arrived, and emotional endurance became as crucial as physical endurance. Makena's motivations evolved from necessity to purpose. Early missions were acts of obligation, born from loyalty or survival instinct, but repeated success and observation of impact revealed a broader horizon. She began to recognize herself as a node within a larger network, a connector whose reliability determined outcomes far beyond her immediate presence. And with this realization came a profound sense of agency. She could influence events without wielding conventional power, shape outcomes without drawing weapons, and preserve lives without entering combat. This form of influence demanded precision, discipline, and resilience, far exceeding the capacity of those around her who wielded authority openly, and it became the defining aspect of her transformation. The psychological weight of responsibility sometimes made solitude desirable, moments in which she could release the constant calculation and rehearsal, yet even in isolation she remained attuned, listening to the language of the land, sensing shifts in wind or shadow, feeling the pulse of life around her as both comfort and warning. She carried water from streams, rested beneath trees, and allowed herself sensory immersion in the environment, inhaling the sharp scent of wet earth, the subtle tang of iron in clay, the whisper of grass against skin, all of it reinforcing the link between body and purpose. These moments of communion were as vital as any tactical preparation, grounding her in self-knowledge and ancestral awareness. Her transformation was both internal and outwardly observable in manner and movement. Makena walked with deliberate economy, conserving energy, yet projecting awareness, gestures minimal yet purposeful, eyes scanning constantly, ears tuned to multiple layers of sound, and her presence conveyed quiet authority without need for declaration. She had learned that vulnerability was dangerous only when visible, and that perception could be managed through posture, rhythm, and interaction, shaping how she was interpreted by those who monitored, underestimated, or sought to control her. Through months of repeated missions, she noticed that anticipation and reaction had begun to fuse into a kind of internal rhythm, a cadence where sensory input, emotional response, and cultural knowledge combined into rapid calculation, the mind functioning like a living compass, constantly orienting towards safety, opportunity, and preservation of community. Mistakes were rare, but when they occurred, she reflected in silence, reconstructing sequences, identifying errors, and integrating lessons into procedural memory. Each error sharpened skill, each success reinforced trust, and she gradually internalized the unspoken equation that survival required: both resilience and subtlety, courage and discretion, observation and execution, forming a cognitive architecture that made her a figure both ordinary and extraordinary, invisible and indispensable. Even as she mastered movement and mental discipline, the emotional cost of sustained vigilance manifested in subtle ways: fleeting loneliness in the absence of her family, a quiet mourning for those captured or lost, the occasional pang of envy at other lives, unconstrained by suspicion. Yet these emotions were neither indulgence nor weakness. They were reminders of her humanity, pulses of awareness that reinforced why her work mattered. Makena's identity became layered, a combination of inherited knowledge, internalized trauma, tactical skill, and moral commitment, and it was within this complex self that she found both purpose and psychological stability. One particular night, as she approached a settlement to deliver critical intelligence about an impending raid, she paused atop a ridge overlooking the low huts, listening to distant firelight and the quiet rhythm of nocturnal life. And in that silence, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, considering how far she had come, how transformation had crept into her being almost imperceptibly, and how survival, skill, identity, and memory had fused to produce a figure capable of navigating colonial pressures, threat, and moral ambiguity with poise and acuity, a human instrument of preservation whose existence would leave few records, but whose impact could alter fates with every step. And as she descended toward her destination under the lattice of shadow and stars, Makena Njeri carried within her not only the messages of the living, but the weight of ancestral knowledge, the lessons of trauma converted to resilience, and the quiet certainty that courage need not roar to be remembered. The sun had barely disappeared behind the highland ridges when Makena Njeri felt the first prickling of unease that would not leave her for the rest of the night. Nairobi's red earth, soft and malleable after the late rains, clung to her sandals like memory, imprinting her passage with every careful step. She paused briefly on a ridge, listening. The faint whistle of the wind through the grass sounded ordinary, yet her instincts honed over years of silent crossings told her that patrols had shifted. She crouched, inhaling the damp scent of soil and smoke from distant cooking fires, letting her eyes adjust to the muted darkness of twilight. Shadows stretched unnaturally, trees swaying in rhythm with her racing heartbeat, and every sound from the scuff of a boot to the clink of a belt buckle was magnified in her mind. This was the night she carried the most critical message of her life. The intelligence that could save entire villages from the sweep the British planned at dawn, and she knew that failure would mean not just capture, but potentially the unraveling of the fragile networks she had spent months threading together. She moved first along a narrow goat path that twisted through a grove of acacia, low branches scraping her arms like the fingers of ghosts, warning her to slow down. Her thoughts flickered briefly to her mother's stories of the old land, of the way ancestors had moved unseen through forests, carrying messages between clans, trading secrets, and warning of danger. She drew strength from those memories now, imagining their eyes watching from the trees, judging her, guiding her, urging her forward. Each step was measured, the loose soil threatening to betray her, yet she pressed, letting her body fall into the rhythm she had internalized over years of courier work. With every heartbeat she rehearsed what she would say, what she would do if confronted, how she would deflect suspicion with silence, with composure. A faint crunch of gravel underfoot made her freeze mid-stride. From the ridge above, the glint of a polished boot reflected the last light of sunset. Soldiers. The patrols had increased, exactly as she had anticipated. Makena's pulse accelerated, but her breathing remained deliberate, shallow, controlled. She tilted her head, listening to the cadence of their voices, low murmurs, laughter that betrayed fatigue, commands half-muttered in the language of authority. Each detail was crucial. Timing, distance, direction, all had to be calculated in real time. She slipped into the shadows of a nearby thicket, letting the soldiers pass by, counting their footsteps, sensing the length of their stride, the rhythm of their march. Her mind catalogued every detail, not as an observer, but as a participant in a lethal dance, one misstep away from catastrophe. As darkness deepened, the air became cooler, carrying the scent of wet grass, river mud, and the faint tang of smoke from distant settlements. Makena pressed herself against the earth, letting the soil cling to her skin, feeling the texture of wet leaves brush against her hands. She listened to the night, letting every cricket chirp, every distant bark, every splash of water through a creek become a coordinate in her internal map. The weight of responsibility settled in her chest like a stone. If she failed, the people she carried messages for could be captured, beaten, imprisoned, or worse. Entire villages depended on her ability to remain unseen, to calculate, to survive. Fear was present, yes, but it was not paralytic. It was precise. It sharpened her mind, focused her senses, and reminded her that survival demanded more than courage. It demanded intelligence, patience, and an unbroken connection to the land she knew as both playground and protector. Hours passed. Each mile she traversed became an exercise in psychological endurance. She counted her steps silently, marking her progress through the invisible grid of hedgerows, streams, and dry riverbeds that only someone intimately familiar with the landscape could navigate. She avoided the main roads where soldiers might linger, choosing instead overgrown paths, dry gullies, and the narrow ridges above cultivated fields. Her hands brushed the tops of tall grass, feeling each stalk as a tactile signal of proximity, each rustle a warning, each smell a marker of human presence or absence. Her mind flickered to the families who depended on her message, to the women and children waiting, their faces bright in her memory, their survival hinging on her precision. She thought of the fear she had carried herself after earlier missions, of the lingering nightmares of being spotted, of the way colonial authority could destroy lives with bureaucratic cruelty or random violence. These memories sharpened her instincts. She adjusted her pace to match the terrain, to avoid creating tracks in soft soil that might be followed. She considered each sound. A distant shout, the hoot of an owl, the faint scrape of a branch, and evaluated whether it was threat or distraction. Every decision was magnified, a choice between life and death, not just for her, but for countless others. She reached a small river just as the moon hid behind clouds and the water glinted faintly in the darkness. She knelt, cupped her hands, and drank, tasting earth and minerals, grounding herself. Every sip reminded her that she existed in the same world as those she sought to protect, that her connection to the land was not merely physical but spiritual, ancestral, imbued with lessons passed down through generations. Crossing the river demanded caution. Wet rocks could betray her footing. Fallen logs could snap. She inched forward, hands outstretched, muscles coiled, listening for movement behind her, aware of the risk of patrols on either side. The chill of the water seeped into her sandals, sending shivers through her legs, but she welcomed it, letting sensation keep her alert. On the far bank, the smell of smoke indicated a distant homestead, someone tending fires, perhaps oblivious to her presence. She stayed low, letting shadows cloak her, following the scent as a guide rather than a distraction. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she ignored it. Every pang reminded her that she had survived worse, that the cost of nourishment was trivial compared to the cost of failing her mission. At the next ridge, she paused again, pressing her forehead to the earth, breathing in the scent of wet soil and crushed leaves, letting her pulse synchronize with the subtle vibrations of the night. Her mind replayed the warnings she carried, the code words, the melodies and rhythms embedded in casual phrases that carried life-saving information. She repeated them quietly, under her breath, letting memory reinforce clarity, letting rhythm reinforce calm. The familiar cadence steadied her, each word a talisman against fear. Hours passed in a blur of motion and calculation. She skirted patrols, avoided paths, pressed through underbrush, counted landmarks, and adjusted for the changing landscape as if the earth itself were a map of potential threats. She imagined herself as both shadow and guide, both courier and protector, letting every step carry the weight of her people's survival. Finally, nearing the village where her message was to be delivered, she paused on a high ridge. Below, lanterns flickered in the distance, homes and fields barely visible in the darkness. She took a deep breath, tasting the smoke and damp earth, feeling the cool air against her skin, feeling the ache in her muscles and the adrenaline in her veins. She considered the countless moments that had brought her here, the trauma endured, the lessons learned, the fear endured and mastered. She descended toward the settlement with quiet confidence, every step deliberate, blending with the night, a lone shadow moving under ancestral guidance. Upon arrival, she delivered her message swiftly, her voice low, measured, the words carrying meaning only to those who understood, and she watched as plans shifted, preparations began, and lives were protected through information she carried entirely in memory. Relief was immediate, yet fleeting. She could not linger, could not allow gratitude to distract her from return. As she retraced her steps through familiar but perilous terrain, she allowed herself a fleeting awareness of transformation. Makena Njeri had moved beyond mere survival. She had become a node, a connector, a living repository of strategy, a master of perception, and a quiet instrument of resistance. Her physical exhaustion was immense, but the deeper fatigue, the emotional and psychological strain was heavier still. The knowledge of what she carried in her mind, of the consequences for failure, of the ancestral weight of her movements, pressed on her like gravity, yet she also felt a calm certainty, a sense of identity and purpose that transcended the fear, the danger, and the darkness of the night. She had transformed in these hours from a messenger to a guardian, from a girl navigating colonial Nairobi to a figure whose actions threaded the survival of entire communities. Each step home was both liberation and preparation, each breath taken a reminder of the responsibility she bore, each shadow she moved through a teacher of vigilance and resilience. By the time dawn touched the highland ridges with muted gold, Makena had already walked more than 20 miles in the dark, yet she carried no weariness in spirit, only a sharpened awareness of her own power to move unseen, to act decisively, and to shape events. The village awoke to normalcy, unaware of the danger avoided, unaware of the courage that had passed invisibly among them, yet Makena Njeri felt the quiet satisfaction of survival and success, the intertwining of cultural knowledge, inherited instincts, and disciplined mind producing results measured not in recognition, but in the continued life and agency of her people. She paused one last time at the edge of a grove, listening to the wind through the trees, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, sensing the network she had preserved and allowing herself the briefest of acknowledgments that she had survived. She had succeeded, and she had begun a transformation that would define not only her own life, but the countless stories that depended on her steps, her silence, her courage, and her unerring instinct to carry the message through the darkness. The night had fallen fully over the highlands, thick darkness pressing down on the landscape like a physical weight, and Makena Njeri moved along paths she had memorized as a child, but now traversed with the acute precision of someone carrying not only messages, but the lives of countless others in her mind. The memory of her last mission lingered, still fresh in muscle and nerve, a mixture of exhaustion and the quiet elation of success, yet there was no time to savor it. Word had come of a new sweep, one that was broader, tighter, more organized than anything she had encountered before. British patrols had learned to anticipate ordinary crossings, and she knew she would have to adapt instantly, to think faster, move slower, appear ordinary, while her mind calculated multiple contingencies simultaneously. Her thoughts flickered to the faces of children she had seen hiding in the shadows during earlier missions, the wide eyes of women clutching the last grain of harvest to feed their families, and the echoes of her own fear as a girl growing up under colonial eyes. Each memory pressed against her consciousness, blending trauma with motivation, fear with determination, forging a psychological tension that sharpened her awareness. She inhaled deeply, tasting damp soil and crushed leaves, the faint, acrid smoke of distant fires, the subtle tang of livestock in the fields, all details layered in a sensory map she would rely on to navigate unseen. Her feet sank into the softened earth with each step, leaving faint impressions that might betray her to the unwary observer, but which she now used as guides to keep her pace steady, measured, deliberate. Every branch, every rustle, every movement of an unseen animal became a signal, each informing whether to proceed, pause, or adjust course. Patrols were closer now, their torches occasionally glinting in the distance, shadows flickering against huts and fences, and she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, not as panic, but as clarity. Her heart rate climbed, her senses sharpened, every nerve ending alert to the imperceptible shifts of wind, the soft snap of a twig, the faint murmur of voices. She rehearsed mental scripts for interrogation, for hiding, for misdirection, the phrases she would offer if discovered, measured, believable, ordinary. Her cultural knowledge was as much a weapon as her instincts. She knew the rituals, the stories, the patterns of community life that allowed her to blend seamlessly, to become one with the environment, invisible not because she tried to disappear, but because she belonged in ways the occupiers could not comprehend. Halfway along the ridge that overlooked a small stream, she crouched beneath an ancient fig tree, pressing her cheek to the damp bark, listening. Footsteps approached from the north, irregular, cautious, boots striking mud with the slow, deliberate rhythm of soldiers alert to possibility, yet unsure of where danger lay. Makena's mind raced through options, calculating the distance, evaluating cover, predicting search patterns, weighing risk versus reward. She considered backtracking, rerouting through a thicker part of the bush, but knew that delay might render the message she carried useless, that the villages she served could be overtaken before she delivered the warning. She drew herself as small as possible, folding into the shadow of the tree, letting her breath slow, letting the pulse of her heartbeat become a silent metronome. Each footstep of the patrol was a drumbeat against which she measured her next movement, every inhale a silent calculation. Her fingers brushed the ground, tracing the edge of the roots, feeling the moisture, the hardness of soil, the subtle changes that signaled whether she would be forced into water or mud. As the soldiers drew nearer, a sense of dread she had learned to recognize settled over her. It was not terror, but anticipation, a focused awareness that failure would mean not only her capture, but potentially death, not just for herself, but for those who relied on her. The patrol halted briefly, voices low, indistinct, carrying the subtle weight of caution and arrogance combined. Makena could feel their uncertainty as acutely as she could smell the smoke of their pipes and the faint metallic tang of their weapons. Every detail of posture, cadence, and spacing was a data point she catalogued in an instant, preparing contingencies, imagining scenarios of confrontation, calculating her next steps with precision honed through countless missions. Her mind replayed childhood lessons, how to move like shadow through grass, how to time breathing with wind gusts, how to read pattern turns invisible to those focused only on the obvious. Trauma from past encounters surfaced briefly, a cold knot in her stomach, but she reframed it as a tool, letting memories of near captures, of screams heard from captured villages, feed her focus rather than her fear. Slowly, with deliberate grace, she slipped from the tree, moving laterally, crouched along the slope toward thicker brush, letting the soldiers pass within 20 paces, mere shadows in her peripheral vision. Her pulse remained steady, breath measured, mind sharp, calculating distances, angles, escape routes. She reached the cover of a thicket, pausing to assess the remaining path. Ahead, the faint glow of lamps marked her destination, the settlement that awaited her warning. She considered the final stretch, aware that the patrol might adjust their search patterns, that the earth itself could betray her with footprints, broken twigs, or snapped grass. The British officers conducting a sweep for precisely the messages she carried, the heightened alertness of their senses, the probability that someone in the network had been compromised, the knowledge that a single misstep could trigger violence, arrest, or death for multiple families. And she allowed herself a quiet moment to acknowledge fear without being consumed by it, letting it fuel precision, clarity, and focus rather than chaos. She navigated between huts, under low-hanging eaves, brushing against the scent of cooking fires, wood smoke, and earth, noting subtle vibrations in the soil, shifts in air movement, the distant clatter of pots and conversations, the rhythm of life continuing under duress, and she understood that her identity, forged in observation, resilience, and ancestral knowledge, was inseparable from the survival of those around her, that every decision she made in the next moments would ripple outward in patterns she could not fully see but could influence profoundly. Reaching the designated recipient, a village elder entrusted with relaying plans to multiple settlements, she paused, inhaled deeply, and spoke the encoded message, voice low, measured, carrying subtle inflections designed to communicate layers of meaning only understood by trained ears. And she watched as comprehension and relief flickered across the elder's face, as immediate action began to take form, as the network she had nurtured sprang to life, and in that instant she felt the culmination of months of preparation, the crystallization of risk, strategy, and ancestral guidance into tangible impact. Yet there was no time for celebration, only the awareness that extraction was equally dangerous, that the return journey demanded the same vigilance, the same integration of sensory input, instinct, and intellect, that the mission was not complete until she returned safely beyond the patrol lines. As she retraced steps through shadowed paths, the night air damp and heavy, sounds amplified in unfamiliar ways. Every snap of twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant call interpreted as potential threat. She reflected on the transformation within herself, how trauma had been converted into acuity, how cultural identity had been weaponized into survival skill, how internalization of fear had become operational, how each step taken for the sake of others reshaped understanding of purpose, agency, and courage. Near the ridge where the patrols had been spotted earlier, she paused, crouched low, and allowed the night to speak through wind, rustling grass, distant animal calls, the faint metallic scent of rifles, integrating all into a coherent pattern, timing breath to movement, heartbeats to shadow, mind to instinct, body to landscape, a choreography of survival informed by experience, memory, and the ethical imperative to preserve life. She passed undetected, every micro-decision affirming months of disciplined observation, and as the outskirts of safe territory came into view, she felt a quiet but profound release. The exhalation of tension mingled with the weight of responsibility. The knowledge that this single crossing had prevented raids, saved lives, maintained continuity of a fragile network, that the work she had done, largely invisible to the outside world, had shifted outcomes in ways empire could not measure or suppress. Resting briefly, she allowed herself reflection, absorbing the psychological and emotional residue, feeling the deep intertwining of trauma, courage, identity, and purpose that had defined her existence. Understanding that every mission, every path, every encoded message was both act of survival and assertion of self, an embodiment of ancestral wisdom and contemporary responsibility, a lived proof that resistance could take subtle, invisible, and profoundly consequential forms. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, illuminating red earth paths and distant homesteads, She moved onward, carrying both exhaustion and clarity, embodying transformation, carrying within herself the stories of survival, the imprint of cultural memory, the lessons of trauma processed into action, the ethical certainty that risk borne thoughtfully could preserve life. And in that moment, walking alone across contested ground, Makena Njeri became both symbol and agent, human and legend, a quiet force shaping history through observation, courage, and the meticulous integration of mind, body, and ancestral knowledge, leaving a trace invisible to the world but indelible in the lives she had protected, in the movements she had enabled, in the resistance she had embodied, in the history that would remember her not in monuments or records, but in the reverberating echoes of courage and survival, in the quiet persistence of people and culture refusing erasure, in the invisible but undeniable mark of one woman who had carried the future in memory, instinct, and heart across the contested lands of Nairobi in 1898.